Good evening. I am Dr. Elena Precario Foley, and I am the Brother John G. Driscoll Professor of Jewish Catholic Studies at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York. Thank you for joining us tonight for Reconsidering the Catholic Church and the Holocaust digital event. Each year, Iona College, a Catholic college, sponsors a Kristallnacht commemoration, along with the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center, which is based in Westchester County, New York. We are very pleased this year to be presenting our program along with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I want to thank the museum at the top of our program for co-sponsoring tonight's program. I especially want to thank all the members of the events and technical team and the scholars in the program on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust. Tonight's discussion is an exciting, timely opportunity to highlight Holy Silence, a thought-provoking new documentary that examines the role of the Vatican and U.S. leaders in shaping the Church's response to the rising Nazi threat and anti-Semitism spreading across Europe. In the midst of this pandemic, Iona remains closed to the public. Our public programs and that of the HHREC and the museum have moved from physical to virtual spaces. But learning about the history of the Holocaust does not have to stop. So, in an age of rising anti-Semitism, we are coming to you from our homes to continue education about the Holocaust. We are grateful for your patience if we experience any technical glitches. This program will be recorded and will be available to view after on the museum's YouTube channel. Our program offers closed captioning. If you would like to use this feature, click the button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. During tonight's show, please send us your questions through the Q&A function. We will get to as many of them as we can. On March 2nd, the Vatican archives for the period of 1939 to 1958 opened, only to close due to the COVID outbreak on March 6th. They reopened to researchers in early June with COVID-based limitations. These COVID limitations have meant that segments of the international research community have still not been able to travel to Rome, where the archives are held. Our guest panelists who will share their expertise with us tonight are Dr. Suzanne Brown Fleming, Director of International Academic Programs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Adam Gregerman, Associate Professor of Theology and Associate Director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. And he is a current member of the museum's Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust. Father Kevin Spicer, the James J. Keneally Distinguished Professor of History at Stonehill College in Easton, Massachusetts. He is a former member of the Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust. And our last panelist is Stephen Pressman, Director and Producer of Holy Silence and the Emmy-nominated 50 Children, the Rescue Mission of Mr. and Mrs. Krause. We're thrilled with the overwhelming interest for tonight's event. Tonight, we will show 3 excerpts from the documentary Holy Silence. So let's get right to our conversation. Kevin, let's begin with you. The relationship between Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII is very important to our topic, and it is explored in the documentary Holy Silence. In your opinion, as a historian, and with your particular perspective as a priest, what are the formative experiences for each pope that help to define the response to Nazism?
Both men are very different individuals. Pius XI was the son of a silk factory merchant. We know him in this picture as older and heavy set, but when he was younger, he was a mountain climber. He climbed Mont Blanc, the second largest mountain in Europe, in 1890. And then he even wrote a book about his experiences mountain climbing that were translated into English in 1923, called Climbs on Alpine Peaks. Pius XII has a very different family experience. His family was part of what is called the Black nobility. These were families that served the Holy See. Many members of his family were lawyers and served the Holy See in this capacity. He'd even contemplated in following in this path. When he was younger, he was athletic, but most of his life he is known to be more ascetic, bookish, and reserved. When we look at their education, they took two different paths too. Pius XI had a very traditional seminary experience. He had doctorates in canon law, philosophy, and theology. Pius XII likewise was an intellectual, very educated individual, very bright. But he received a dispensation to study for the priesthood as a day student. He lived at home among his family and only attended school in seminary during the day. He too earned several doctorates in canon law, in civil law, philosophy, and theology. Pius XI, as he began his career as a priest, began his ministry, and began working for the Holy See, first he was a professor of dogmatic theology at Padua Seminary, following, it would seem, an academic path in life. He was a very gifted linguist. He was a prefect of Ambrosian Library in Milan. He was first working then, after working in Milan, at the Vatican Library. They discovered him and his gifts there in that role. And he ended up becoming the prefect of the Vatican Library in 1914. Soon he was asked to engage in diplomatic service, and he became apostolic vicar to Poland and to Lithuania. In 1919, he was asked to become nuncio to Poland. There, in that role, he was confronted by Bolsheviks in August 1920. And he also faced Polish nationalists who made many accusations, and he was forced to leave Poland. So he had this experience of nationalism behind him and this experience of really anti-communism. In 1920, he became Archbishop of Milan and led that archdiocese pastorally, and then Pope in 1922. Pius XII was a Vatican insider when we look at his career. He was noticed very early on by Pietro Gasparri, the secretary of the Sacred Congregation for Extraordinary Affairs. Soon he would take over from Gasparri and also become the secretary of the same congregation in 1914. In 1917, Benedict XV appointed him nuncio to Bavaria. There in Munich, he was confronted in April 1919, and his life was threatened by Bolsheviks during the revolutions that were taking place in Germany in 1918 and 1919. He survived, he lived through this experience. While he was in Munich, he was exposed to a lot of reactionary movements, including those with very conservative thought. And he also saw the anti-Catholicism of the authoritarian right that it was existence then. Soon he would be called away from Munich, and he would be asked to go to Berlin, originally appointed in 1920 as the nuncio of all of Germany. In 1925, he moved to Berlin, and he continued in this role. Even though he was seen as ascetic and he was seen as rather reserved, he was very culturally adept, and he was very active on the cultural scene. He was introduced to many individuals by his friend, Father Ludwig Kaas, the priest leader of the Catholic Center Party, and a controversial figure later with the Concordat between National Socialist Germany and the Vatican. But Kaas was very well connected. Through this and through all the contacts that he made in Germany during over quite a few years, he got to know the German culture very well. He learned the German language, he was fluent in it, and he really had a very positive experience. That experience and his contact with people from Germany really kind of marked his outlook on Germany and the German people. Pius XI did not have the same experience of Germany, and so through both of them, they have different experiences in their formation. But I think if you have to look at one thing, I think both of them were just different individuals. Pius XI was known as being temperamental. He reacted. He was not reserved. He was not, in a sense, that full diplomat who was always cautious in his words, where Pius XII was much more cautious. People remark that he knew when to be quiet and when to make a statement. And so these are the pictures that we have of these two individuals who were faced with great challenges during both their pontificates.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was very helpful in setting the stage to understand these two men. Steve, I'd like to delve deeper into the timeliness of tonight's event. As we noted at the top of the program, the Vatican's wartime archives were open this year. How did and does this affect your film? And what is the significance for you of choosing the title Holy Silence?
I have to tell you that when I was working on the film, and it took me a couple of years to put this film together, I always knew, at least I kept in the back of my mind, at some point we all knew that the long held secret archives pertaining to Pius XII were going to be released. But of course, I'm no Vatican insider at all, and I had no idea about the timing of when those archives were going to be released. So to be very honest, I tried to set that particular issue aside as I went about putting the film together and doing my research and conducting interviews with people like Kevin and Suzanne, who are part of the program this evening. I relied on them for their expertise, but again, I always knew in the back of my mind. And I have to say that I had a little bit of a panic in terms of the timing of all this, because in March of 2019, just as I was working with my film editor and putting pretty much the final touches on the film, Pope Francis announced that a year later, in March of this year, the archives were going to be released. And I have to tell you, for about 24 hours, I was in a bit of a panic, not knowing what the release of the archives was going to do or potentially do in terms of the film that I essentially had completed at that point. And, I called around, I talked to people like Kevin, I remember talking to Suzanne and some others who were in the film, and they all pretty much sort of talked me off the ledge in a sense by saying, look, Steve, we've all been waiting for years for these archives. There are millions and millions upon millions of pages of documents. So the odds are pretty good that nothing is going to dramatically change, or at least anytime soon. And I felt a little calmer about that. And then, of course, the timing was kind of nice because the film came out pretty much just as the archives were being opened. And I think we've all recognized that this issue has the profile of the issue has been raised because of the timing of the opening of the archives. So I think that's been a good thing in terms of the film. And you asked about the title of the film. It's no accident that it's hardly an accident at all that the name of the film is Holy Silence. But there's also a little story there, because when I was first working on the film, for a while, the working title of the film was different. It was Holy Secrets. Again, an allusion, a reference to what had still been the secret archives pertaining to Pius XII. And one thing I did do immediately after Pope Francis announced that the archives were going to be released was I knew I had to change the title of the film. And that's when this concept of silence, which I think is a significant one, and I think we'll be talking about that over the course of the next hour or so, what it means to be silent. Kevin described Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli, as somebody who had the temperament sometimes to know when to stay silent and sometimes when to make a declaration. And I think I worked sort of with that theme because part of the controversy surrounding Pius XII all these years later is whether or not that was the time to remain silent during the years of his papacy, particularly as the Shoah, as the Holocaust was unfolding. And so there was significance, in my mind at least, in the decision to title the film Holy Silence.
Thank you. Yes, the concept of silence and surrounding Pius XII has been and will remain quite controversial, and we'll see what the archive shed on that over the coming years. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions via the Q&A function on your screen, and we will answer as many of them as we can tonight. To get us started on our next question, let's view a clip from the film featuring historian Robert Ventresca.
We've just learned so much more about what was actually said, not said, what was actually done or not done. And I hope that we can finally come away from these really simplistic caricatures, either that he's Hitler's Pope or he's a righteous Gentile. So it's important not to demonize him. But I think, canonizing him literally or figuratively is another matter as well.
So Adam, I'm going to put you on the hot seat and ask you, you're a scholar of early Jewish and Christian texts and their interrelationship. And as an expert in contemporary Jewish-Christian dialogue, could you comment on best practices for approaching the evaluation of the actions of the Vatican and its leaders during Nazism, especially in the context of Jewish-Christian relations today?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, let me start. Thank you for including me. And I also want to recognize the really remarkable nature of an event like this. In many ways, it's easy for us, especially in America or perhaps the West, to take this sort of event as, just a normal thing to happen. But what we have tonight is a Catholic university commemorating an event that occurred to Jews in 1930s Germany, making that an event that includes people from the community, Jewish and Christian scholars from elsewhere. It's worth stopping for a moment and appreciating just how far the relationship between these two traditions has come. I mean, there's a lot of hope, and that's one of the reasons why it's worth saying, this is something to celebrate, to celebrate this relationship, even when we commemorate obviously a very tragic event. So Elena, thanks for mentioning my own scholarship. I've kind of straddled a few different worlds. I've worked on the ancient Jewish and Christian texts, and then I'd say primarily have been working on contemporary Jewish-Christian relations, though the fact that these texts are often separated by 2,000 years doesn't mean a whole lot. That is, they are as live in the contemporary world as they were when they were written. And so New Testament texts, early Christian texts, especially those that are focused on establishing religious community that is defined as not Judaism. Those are extremely important texts for the way in which they will shape centuries of Christian behavior from then on. Now, it's really helpful to understand that past history because, and I think this is sort of across the board, for those of us involved in contemporary Jewish-Christian relations, there is a kind of unavoidable and often painful grappling with the past, with teachings and texts, right? And so if you're part of a religious community, you don't just say, yeah, all right, well, those things, we don't like them anymore, just get rid of them. Rather, texts, ideas, traditions need to be wrestled with and made relevant in new circumstances. And those those ancient texts are, of course, profoundly marked by anti-Judaism for complicated reasons. Deeply infusing Christian views, Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox, up through the 20th century. The ideas developed in the first century have, in many cases, sadly, legs. One of the texts that I think is worth paying attention to. It gets raised in the movie, and maybe I'll come back to that later, is the encyclical Humani Generis Unitas that was never published, but it illustrates some of the tensions between a history of ancient Judaism that was a presentation of ancient Judaism, of Judaism itself, very negative, as well as attempt to somehow defend Jews and Judaism. And that text is a good example of how it's not easy to do. You know, as someone who committed to Jewish-Christian relations in the present period, that history, of course, often baleful, is not the whole story. And the remarkable changes that have taken place, I mean, above all, beginning with Nostra Aetate, is a 180-degree shift, really grappling with just the extremely difficult issues. You know, fortunately, as some of the low-hanging fruit, the ridiculous issues of Jews as Christ killers, I mean, you know, it's wonderful that when those were taken on in the Second Vatican Council and other Christian texts, they just sort of disappear. They're so absurd. And what's left are more serious questions for Jews and Christians to talk about together, and more substantive ones, more positive ones about covenant, about how we read our texts. The last thing I would just note here is, to go broad for a moment, this may sound sort of simplistic, but I often have to remind people not to generalize about Jewish-Catholic relations or how one group sees or treats the other. Let me speak from within the Jewish community as a Jew. Many people do not seem to be aware of the changes that have taken place that have dramatically altered how Catholics are taught about Jews and Judaism. And I feel a very profound responsibility to in a sense, not bear false witness, or to not let people bear false witness in being unaware of the good that has taken place. And I think it's very important, I'll say for myself as a Jew, to educate my fellow Jews to be aware of things getting better. Sometimes I think we're a little wary of doing that as Jews, but actually sometimes it happens.
Thank you, Kevin. I think those cautions are good for all of us, and not, you know, and for Christians not to generalize in the other direction as well. So thank you for raising that issue. Suzanne, you were excited to dive deeply into the archives late last winter, and then the pandemic hit. You were able to spend a week in the Vatican Apostolic Archive last month, however. From your perspective as a historian, and knowing the volume of documents now released, could you comment on the process of archival research and the thorny question of when is it too soon to render opinions or verdicts on contested questions, such as we have with the many historical, political, and moral questions surrounding the Vatican and the Holocaust?
Thank you for that question, and good evening, everybody. I think it might be helpful to start with a little bit of a description of how the archives are organized. It feels like a bit of a black box. The picture you see here are actually shelves of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the former Vatican Secret Archive. What happened on March 2nd of this year was not just one archive, but multiple archives opened, at least 6 rather large ones and dozens of smaller ones of dicasteries and religious houses, etc. Taking all of these 6+, as I call them, archives together, the estimated number of new pages of material for scholars is over 16 million. And it's also worth pointing out that you can see here, this is paper. Most of these 16 million new pages are not digitized. There's an exception that the Archive of the Secretary of State, a portion of those are digitized, 1.3 million pages. But mostly it's that old-fashioned process that I had to do and Kevin had to do when we were dissertation students, of looking through folders of pieces of fragile paper and reading those materials. These are also materials in dozens of languages, and there's Italian, of course, and some Latin, but also whatever country that document is coming from or about, that language is needed too. And they're spread across Vatican City and Rome. So research is actually, I'll add one more piece to this that makes the research itself extremely complex and painstaking and not so fast. Each of these different archives have their own system of registration as well. You have to apply to the director of the archives and to the prefect to get permission to use them. And each one has a separate system for finding aids. Each one has a separate system for hours or reserving a seat. So there's a lot of preparation. I think I researched about 6 months just to be prepared when I got to Rome. So that is a long way of saying this is going to be a slow process. It's hard in our internet instant gratification world today to realize this is going to take us many years, but it's going to take us many years. On the question of how soon and when can we render judgment? Well, I think that we should all be careful about rendering judgment, and often, in my view, the documents will speak for themselves. So I guess I would put the question a little bit differently, that when there are a significant number of documents on a subject that's important and we can publish those documents and talk about those documents, then we can start making judgments about those documents.
Thank you. 16 million, did you say? 16 million pages. So not something my freshman would want to read, I tell you that. Steve, back to you. Kind of the other side, the archival research. And now, what can you share with us about your filmmaking and your research process, and what led to your interest in this topic?
Well, in terms of the research, as a filmmaker, I can take some shortcuts, to be honest. What you're looking at is a photograph of Professor Ventresca, Robert Ventresca, when we conducted an interview with him in this gorgeous chapel at King's College, where he teaches up in Ontario, Canada. It was a snowy weekend. My cameraman and I drove up from Buffalo. We had flown into Buffalo and took a little detour to stop at a frozen Niagara Falls. It was a wonderful, wonderful trip. But I mentioned that by way of describing the research that a filmmaker does. So as opposed to the scholarship and the expertise as historians that folks like Suzanne and Kevin bring to the table, that really isn't my job as a filmmaker. I'm not digging through the archives myself. I'm going to the experts like Kevin and Suzanne, who have done the hard work for me, and people like Professor Ventresca, David Kurtzer, and others who are in the film. I'm relying on their expertise. I'm just sitting them down in front of a camera, and they're doing the heavy lifting for the film. Obviously, a film as a visual piece of art, the research that I do involves looking for interesting pieces of old newsreel footage or photographs or documents, or the visual elements that go into making a film what it is. And for me, that's the fun stuff. And then, but the people who are really doing the hard work are Kevin and Suzanne and Robert and David Kurtzer and others. I came into this project, and I have to admit, knowing very, very little about this episode in history. I was a Jewish kid growing up in the 50s and 60s in Los Angeles, and I did not know about popes and long lost Vatican documents, and much, if anything at all, about the controversy that has surrounded, in particular, Pius XII. But as I was finishing up my previous film, this film about a children's rescue story, I had been in discussions with Suzanne and some of her colleagues at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And in particular, I began to learn about some of their longstanding and ongoing efforts to work with the Vatican, particularly over issues of access to archives. And that sort of got some wheels spinning in my head about the possibility of shaping a film around this topic. I have now a bookshelf filled with books written by some of our speakers this evening and plenty of others. So I had all of the research done for me, but I was also interested, and I think most of the folks tuning into the program tonight have seen the film. I was also interested in telling a little bit of an American piece of this story, and in particular, looking at some of the American figures who were trying to play a role in behind the scenes role in influencing one way or another how the Vatican and how two particular popes, Pius XI and Pius XII, were responding to these dark events unfolding in Europe in the 30s and then leading into the real horrors of the Holocaust. So for instance, the remarkable story of Father John Lafarge, the New England Jesuit priest who gets summoned by Pius XI to help draft an encyclical that would have taken a fairly strong stance against anti-Semitism. Again, that's a story that I certainly didn't uncover. It's been written about. Everybody on the panel tonight is intimately familiar with that story. But that was a story that I don't think was all that broadly known outside of academic circles. And from a filmmaker's point of view, I think it lent itself to kind of a dramatic retelling in the course of a documentary film about this period. And so for me, the research and the filmmaking process pretty much involved finding these disparate characters, Father Lafarge, President Roosevelt, people who were working sort of behind the scenes at that time to try to influence Vatican policies. And for me, that was the real joy of putting this film together.
Thank you. I do think I agree with you, and I appreciate the fact that you did focus on Father Lafarge's work, and the way you told the story also gives us insight, or those who wouldn't know how Vatican communications work, into things aren't so direct, at least pre-Vatican II, of how someone can approach the Pope and vice versa and whatnot. So it's I think you did a real service with that aspect of it, and I'm always happy to see that story, the John Lafarge story, brought forward to more people. We have a very short clip of our panelist, Kevin Spicer, that we're going to go to now, and then I'm going to ask Kevin to talk more about the ideas in that clip. So why don't we go to that clip now?
Negative teaching about Jews that originates from the earliest years of Christianity, where Jews are portrayed in a negative light. Over the centuries, as Jews were vilified, that vilification became intensified.
So Kevin, earlier Adam referred to history of negative teachings in Christian texts embedded in some of the earliest Christian texts. And in this clip, you're noting the same thing, talking about vilification of the Jewish people and then saying that became intensified. Could you expand on your thinking in that clip? And I know that there's a lot that goes behind what you were saying, and offer a few comments on the history of Christian anti-Judaism, what it has to do with anti-Semitism. That distinction in and of itself is controversial, as we know. The relationship of that history of anti-Judaism to the Holocaust, and most importantly, shall we say, the readiness of Christians to speak out or not speak out against the Nazi genocide of the Jews in light of their inheriting this history of anti-Judaism?
Teach a whole course on this, so I'll do my best to answer this in just a few minutes, or at least give you some thoughts. We begin with the idea of anti-Judaism or anti-Judaic expressions, and we find their origins, as we've seen in some of the images in the New Testament text, both in the Gospels and in the letters, and also in the writings of the early church authors. We look at just a basic Gospel passage from Matthew 27:25. His blood be on us and on our children, as Jesus is before Pilate, the words placed into the mouths of Jews. In a sense that that charge that Jews are Christ's killers, that they're responsible for Christ's death, at the very beginning of Christianity, inherent in the gospel texts that are proclaimed continuously over the centuries, gospel texts that are still proclaimed today from the pulpit in all Christian traditions, and gospel texts that people listen to, and if not offered through a very clear homily, through commentary, can be taken in a very offensive way and can be embraced. The Gospel of John uses the term the Jews, often in a very negative light, as kind of a summary expression of opposition to Christ. All of this ties into a theology of supersessionism, of replacement, that the Abrahamic and the Mosaic covenants have been replaced by Christ, that Jews and the Jewish faith are not necessary because Christ has come, and in a sense there's a new covenant between the followers of Christ and God. All of this portrays Jews as the other, and that compounds over the centuries. In the 14th century, for example, we see Jews being blamed by Christians for the Black Death, that they're poisoning wells, they're accused of that. In the 15th century, we see the rise of the ritual murder charge, claiming that Jews need to have the blood of Christian infants or Christian children for rituals. That goes all the way to the 20th century. We have cases in Germany and the Weimar Republic right before the Nazi period, where there's similar cases, especially in more rural areas. So we move beyond just a Christian anti-Judaism or a Christian anti-Judaic thought into much more broader thought that is negative towards Jews, that encompasses economic anti-Semitism, encompasses societal anti-Semitism. We know from history that Jews were forced into professions, not always by their own choosing. They were excluded from guilds. They were excluded from other professions. One profession they were not excluded from was profession concerning banking or lending. And often those professions in the medieval period, the late medieval period, early modern Europe have very negative connotations because people have to borrow money and then they have to pay it back. And it was so easy to vilify people who were involved in those professions. And so that whole image creates this whole economic anti-Semitism associating Jews with money in a very negative way, even though they've been forced in a sense. There were very few professions open to them. A lot changes in the 19th century, because in the 19th century, as Europeans are becoming more and more open, as there is talk of more freedom, as class barriers are breaking down, as the middle class is very clearly present, what happens is many of the European nations start freeing Jews from rules that they had been bound to since the medieval period. And in a sense, they're emancipated. They're no longer forced to live in certain areas which have been labeled ghettos in different European cities. They're able to participate in politics and public life. There's a great mixture of individuals in Europe in the 19th century, especially towards the end. People who hated Jews, they originally could see them negatively religiously, or they could see them negatively in these other images that I've shared, now have to find new reasons to hate them. The hatred is still there. And so you have these individuals who are grasping at what can we do? And one individual by the name of Wilhelm Marr in 1878, person who's an agitator, he comes up with the idea of using this term Semitic, which at that time referred to Middle Eastern languages, kind of placing that on the Jewish people as if they referred to the Jewish people as a race. And in a negative light, comes up with the term of anti-Semitism, almost negatively. This is the term we're going to use to talk negatively about Jews. What forms him is kind of a misunderstanding of Darwinism, a misuse of Darwinism, that in called social Darwinism, that one group of people is better than another group of people, that in a sense, inherently in the way that people are made and the blood of individuals, that they are different. And they're trying to create a separate classification, in a sense, between peoples. The eugenics movement is a part of that, in a sense of bettering the humankind, but seen in a very negative light. And the most negative light for people who of course practice anti-Semitism and proclaim it is hatred of the Jews. I'm covering a lot of material in just a short period of time, but you can see how all of that is kind of brought together. All of this is picked up by people who have ethno-nationalist thought, religious ethno-nationalist thought, or plain ethno-nationalist thought. People in Germany are part of a movement called the Folkish movement, kind of a racial blood, soil-based movement that is exclusionary, very extreme nationalistic, wanting to separate Jews, German Jews, out of society. And in other countries, these same expressions have existence or have people proclaiming them, who are agitators, who are authors. A lot of it very fictional, all of it's fictional in nature, but using that to promote hatred. In all of this, when we look at that, we see the Jew as being portrayed as the other, not as my neighbor, not as my brother or sister, but as the other, something, some people, some individual to be vilified. At the root of that, when we look at that, how can anybody even begin to say that a Jewish person should be treated like this? Why? Because at the root of that, the seedbed of that is Christian teaching at the very beginning of Christianity. And that has become the root that has continued to grow and continued, in a sense, to vilify and continue to attack Jews over the centuries. One point that is very interesting, however, is when we look at some of the National Socialist publications, the publications of the Nazis. We take one in particular, Der Stürmer, a very hate-filled newspaper that came out of Nuremberg. Julius Streicher was the editor. And it had lots of negative imagery, some of it negative Christian imagery, and some of it, most of it negative anti-Jewish imagery, anti-Semitic imagery. But the Nazis were not just reaching people by just racial anti-Semitism. They were reaching people by going back into the history of Christian anti-Semitism and finding those images of Jews that were negative, of the Black Death, of the ritual murder charge, creating characters almost pornographic in nature and publishing that in order to instill in people the racial anti-Semitism of the day. Interestingly enough, another factor is what the church has done even today. In a document we remember that was issued in recent years by the Vatican, acknowledging some of the faults of the church during the Holocaust period. There's a very clear dichotomy that's created. The church's teaching, the anti-Jewish teaching that existed, but then making it very separate, racial anti-Semitism, as if there was no connection between the two. That is an image that the church likes to portray regularly. And I think we heard echoed in some of the comments of one of my confreres in the film towards the very end, that in a sense, the church is not responsible. Christianity is responsible. Christianity has taken many steps with Nostra Aetate during Vatican II to look at this teaching and to move away from it and to condemn it. But we still have a long ways to go in preaching, in our ministry, in the way that Christians express their love of God. There still is anti-Semitism at times. Not everywhere, but it does exist. And that's why we study, and that's why we learn and continue to try to understand this period to make sense of it. Your last question, I think, Elena, that you said, how were they open to this? Well, I think I've given some clues to that. It was already ingrained in them. Most Christians in 1930s Germany, most Christians in 1930 Europe had some form of anti-Semitism within them. The church even taught it was okay to be, to have a dislike for Jews if they were doing certain things in society, but you could not hate them racially. That was an official teaching. You can find that bishops said that and church people said that. So it's a reality that is there. And I think that was a part of the society of the day. I asked a woman in Berlin when I was working on a book for my dissertation a long time ago, I said, when we look at that specifically, we look at the question of Jews as responsible for the death of Christ. Were you ever taught that when you were a young child in religious education class? And she said to me, we were never taught it, but we knew it. It was accepted. It was ingrained in society. And that's what we're working to unpack today.
Thank you, Kevin. It's such a sobering history. And I know that you join me in gratitude for scholars and companions along the way, like Adam on our panel tonight, who will, courageously enter that dialogue with Christians in light of this history. So moving along, because we will want to get to questions, and viewers, please give us your questions. Suzanne, we're going to go to a clip that is much longer than the other clips we've seen tonight. It juxtaposes statements from Father Hoffman of the Vatican, a nun, an Italian Jew, and the historian Dr. Susan Zuccotti. So let's see what they say, and then maybe you can make a few comments on a question I have.
Pius XII did a lot for the Jewish people, but behind the scenes. What he could do, he did, but he had to be cautious. It's a fact that during World War II, during the occupation here in Rome, a lot of Jewish people were saved and rescued. They were hidden in convents, in monasteries, even the Vatican. The Pope is the head of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church. The priests and nuns wouldn't have done that without the approval of Pius XII.
Durante il periodo della guerra, le suore, e dietro il consiglio e non imposizione da parte del Santo Padre Pio XII, hanno aperto anche loro le porte, perché volevano veramente condividere il desiderio del Santo Padre, che ha fatto tanto per salvare questi nostri fratelli.
My grandfather didn't get this invitation. Most of the Roman Jews had to find their ways, and they could have been warned. That would have been enough, trust me. This would have been enough. My grandfather, who had at that time 3 children, they went to hide in a carpenter factory where my grandfather's brother had a job. The boss of this place, who was not Jewish, let them stay. My great-grandmother, she was arrested in May 44, so she basically left Rome, I think with the last train that ever arrived in Poland. And then when she arrived in Auschwitz, she was immediately gassed.
Gli SS sono entrati nel monastero e volevano perquisire il monastero. E quanto è entrato questi SS, perché volevano portare via gli ebrei nascosti, c'era una superiora molto energica e di fronte a questa affermazione lei ha avuto il coraggio, disinvolta, lasciando così come se niente fosse, i nostri fratelli ebrei sono stati salvati.
The story of Jews hiding in monasteries and convents and Catholic schools and Catholic hospitals is a very complicated one. There's been very little evidence of a papal role in the opening of these institutions. They were aware And absolutely no question that the Pope had called for the need for compassion for the victims of war. But he had not directed institutions to open their doors.
So the clip really demonstrates the differences of opinions that are out there. Historians don't trade in opinions, they trade in texts. And I know historians like you avoid making predictions, but I'm wondering what you're thinking. Will the archives be able to shed some light on these very contested questions of whether Pope Pius XII specifically directed religious communities, nuns, priests, and so forth to hide Jews? Will we learn more about individual Catholics who saved Jews and if they were acting on their own or in response to papal directives?
Yeah, that is absolutely a hot button issue, and Susan Zuccotti has more expertise than I, but I would make a couple of comments. It's worth mentioning that one document that Professor Kurtzer and his team surfaced from the new material was dated a few months after the October 1943 roundup of Jews by the Gestapo and their deportation under the very windows of the Pope, that famous phrase. And 2 months after the October 1943 roundup, Pius XII's key advisor to Mussolini, a man named Tacchi Venturi, suggested that in the wake of continuing roundups and the continuing need of Jews to be hidden in Rome, perhaps some kind of diplomatic statement through private channels should be made to stop these deportations that were the reason why Jews needed to hide. And what Professor Kurtzer and his researchers found is that ultimately Pacelli, Pius XII, decided not to take Tacchi Venturi's advice, having received different advice from another person I think we'll be hearing a lot about the next few years, Angelo Delacroix. So this is one of those footballs that the defenders of Pius XII and the, I guess, let's just call them accusers of Pius XII toss back and forth. And if you are among Pius XII's, and they're very black, very kind of black and white sides. If you're on the side of the defenders, then of course it must be true that Pius XII issued some kind of order. He might not have written it down because these were dangerous times, and Gestapo and Nazis were everywhere, spies were everywhere within the Vatican. So we may never find a written order, but the reasoning goes on the defender's side, it would have been impossible for all of these religious houses in Rome and outside of Rome to hide Jews without the Pope knowing about it and approving it. And therefore, that makes Pius XII one of the great rescuers of Roman Jews. So that's the one side of the argument. Then there's the other side of the argument that Susan really, Professor Zuccotti really put her finger on it, but we don't have written evidence. So we don't really know. What we know for sure is hundreds of Jews, thousands of Jews even, were hidden in Italy and in Rome and even on Vatican property. What we don't know is, was this something spontaneous? Was it a matter of a Jewish family knocking on the door of a convent in the middle of a raid and saying, please let me in, and the Mother Superior or the nun opening the door in that moment said, yes, please come in and I will hide you. And then maybe days later, let it be known that this family was hidden in church property. Was it? So that I think we will find out a lot more about the way rescue function, because that's essentially what this question is. How did rescue function? And we don't know the whole story yet. It's going to take a number of years in the archives. I know that Hubert Wolff's team in Munster is already looking at this issue. Several Italian researchers are looking closely at this issue. Professor Kurtzer is looking at this issue. How did rescue function? The only thing I think we can say for certainty, besides Jews were indeed hidden on church property, is the Holy Father, Pius XII, would have to have known about it. We know also from Professor Kurtzer's work that almost everything that went on, really everything that went on within, at the levels of those kinds of levels in Rome, the Pope knew about, discussed, and we can say he didn't necessarily kick anybody out. I know Professor Zuccotti has also found evidence where hiding Jews was frowned upon in some orders and in some places because it was dangerous to that church property. So no definitive answers yet, but I think 2 years from now, we will have some kind of definitive answer.
Thank you so much. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to go right to Adam. And then after this question, we'll go right to questions and answers, and we have a number of them that have come in. This documentary is part of a larger body of research attempting to assess what Pope Pius XII did and did not know, as we were just saying, as Suzanne was just, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I am actually, okay. I lost my, excuse me, viewers. In the film, Professor Zuccotti and Thayer remark on Pius's 1942 Christmas message. And Pius said, hundreds of thousands of persons, and with no fault on their part, sometimes only because of their nationality or race, have been consigned to death or to a slow decline. Since Pius XI's hidden encyclical, written by the American Jesuit priest, Father John Lafarge, mentioned earlier tonight, since that did not get to see the light of day, Adam, what do you think it would have meant in the midst of the Holocaust, not only for Jews, but for Catholics as well, if Pius XII had been direct in his 1942 Christmas message and used the words Jews and anti-Semitism instead of the oblique references to nationality and race? What does it mean now? What did it mean then?
Yeah, so thank you. There are a number of different questions here, right? There are historical questions, there are moral questions, there are conjectural questions, right? There's crystal ball type questions or what might have happened questions. Let me see if I can address a few of these different types of questions. I mean, so I'll address the most speculative question, which would be the potential effect of different actions by church leaders or the Pope himself in, for example, using language like Jews and not generic terminology. There's no way to know this, but I will say my sense is that that type of explicit language would have had little practical effect. I mean, for starters, I suspect, and there are others who know this better than I do, but that it was not a mystery who it was that were largely bearing the brunt of Nazi persecution. It's a fairly low bar, if anything, to set for Pius XII to say, you know, if he'd only said that word, you know, why didn't he say that word? What would have happened if he did? You know, there's a lot of speculation here, but I'm not sure that that the issue deserves a whole lot of attention because I suspect it wouldn't have mattered. I will, however, note that these sorts of questions are relevant for assessments of the behavior of the church during the war, right? So the words matter and the statements matter, not so much at the time, but they do matter when we look back and try to assess what it was that leaders were doing and hopefully, if possible, why. Let me mention the Lafarge encyclical. The encyclical that was never issued, Humani Generis Unitas, is a complicated document, and I want to include it here in just my brief remarks because it's tempting to think about what would have happened had that encyclical been published. And it is certainly the case that it is highly critical of racial racial discrimination against Jews. It is forward thinking, it is progressive on that topic. And that's all to be welcomed. At the same time, it is harshly anti-Jewish. It talks about Jews as being doomed to wander the earth, Jews to be separated out from Christians, Jews as Christ killers. Right? This is a late 1930s document that's trying to say hating Jews for racism is bad, but not liking Jews for religious reasons is good. And it's actually quite a disheartening document when read in its entirety. And so I'm somewhat doubtful about the effect that that would have had at the time, had it been issued, but also tells us something about where the church was at that time, which, as we look back upon it, we can say something like, well, what did the church do as far as its traditional views of Jews and Judaism? Well, it hadn't quite grappled with those by the late 30s, as we can see. And I'll just underscore, there's no hint really of the changes that are to come starting in the 1960s, of course, the prominent changes in the Second Vatican Council. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all our panelists. And now we're going to try to get in some of our audience questions. And the first question that from the audience is for Suzanne. And it is, can something be said about the secret archive papers, that's in quotes, released by the Vatican this year? What exactly do they consist of? Why the delay in releasing them? Who will have access to them? And will there be any restrictions to that access?
That's a large set of questions. What was released? What was released on March 2nd of 2020 were all the documents pertaining to the Pontificate of Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli. That means, in practical terms, all documents from 1939, when Pacelli became Pope, to 1958, when he died. So we're talking, these 16 million pages that I mentioned earlier fall within the 1939 to 1958 period of time. As I mentioned before, they were at one time concentrated mostly in what used to be called the Vatican Secret Archive, and now that is no longer the case. The so-called Pope's Archive, now called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, has a huge number of critical documents for our topic of the Holocaust and post-war period, but so does the Archive of the Secretary of State. Think of that as a foreign ministry in a city-state. There is something called the Archive for the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. That means Catholic practice, basically. The Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples. That means efforts to spread Christianity in other parts of the world. You can already see why these are going to be very relevant to these questions, just knowing what these archives are. And then there are all the religious houses and orders, and even St. Peter's Cathedral, for example. Some Jews, we think, were hiding there too. All of those archives as well. So we're talking about, like I say, this 6+. You can't just walk into any of these archives. You need to go to the website on the Vatican's website and identify which archive you want to use, and who is the director of that archive, who's the person making the decision as to whether you can enter. You have to make an application typically, or at least write to the director of the archive for permission. And then when you come to Rome or Vatican City, depending on which archive you're working in, you will have a set of user rules specific to that archive as well, and a set of finding aids and tools. So this is, it's very complicated research. Those of you who followed the work of David Kurtzer in The Atlantic, as he was putting together the story of the Finale Boys, you might have noticed that he had to actually go he and his collaborators had to go to 4 different of these newly opened archives to piece together that story. He had to use the Pope's archive, the Secretariat of State's archive, the Propaganda Fide archive, and at least one other to piece together different documents and tell the story of the Finale boys. I do have a good set of cheat sheets if anybody wants them, of websites, addresses, links to get you started if you're interested in travel to Rome and Vatican City. And why were they closed so long? That was a part of the question as well. Typically, the archives for a pontificate for the period of Pope is on St. Peter's throne do not open for, maybe Kevin will know exactly, but I think it's at least 75 years typically. And these archives, Pope Francis made an exception. He opened the 1939 to 58 materials early. He did so in his own telling when on the day in March 2019 that he opened them, he did so for the good of the universal church to be open. He said famously, the church is not afraid of history. Let's let researchers come do their work. And there has been a call to open these archives since the 1960s, really, ever since the first critique of Pius XII and those around him started to surface and become a world debate that it still is today. There have been calls from Catholic community, from Jewish community, from all over the world to open these archives. One reason it took so long is, and when you're in the Vatican Apostolic Archive finding aid or indices room, you can really see for your own eyes. The finding aids are excellent and very meticulous, and 24 researchers worked for more than 10 years to go through the material themselves and to structure it into folders and create finding guides and give 2 or 3 sentence description of what is in each folder so that a researcher like myself can look in that finding guide or indices and say, okay, I think I want to order these specific folders in that specific collection. So that was enormously time-consuming work. And I guess I would just end this question with my sense, having been there and keeping up on discussions on this issue, is there is true openness now, that there's really a desire for researchers to do this work and to do it carefully and well.
And that takes time.
Yes.
We have many good questions. Here's another. It's not directed at any particular panelist. What would be the types of questions you would have wanted to introduce to papal political calculations during the Holocaust? What type of questions should religious leaders ask before they weigh in on situations which have consequences, not just for targeted populations, but also co-religionists, which might also be at risk in those countries if leaders speak out? Easy question.
What would Jesus do? I mean, some of them are such straightforward moral questions. I'm not even being flip, you know.
Yeah, I have thoughts on that as well, but I just spoke, so I want to make sure that if Kevin or Steve have any kind of response.
I'm going to defer to the scholars on this one.
I don't know if you have thoughts, Kevin. I certainly do.
It's a major question, and there was a lot to be weighed, and I think that's what a lot of people have used in their argumentation when we're speaking about Pius XII and when he spoke, and why he did not speak out as clearly. And then there is, as Adam has said, there's the moral voice of what the church should have done, and the difficulty of the time and where people were. Each country, as you've noted in the question, it's a very good question because it's been thought out. each country was very different in the way that the church operated there and what the church was doing, its relationship with the state. There were countries the church was very involved. I mean, you look at Slovakia, where the leader of the country was a Catholic priest, Tiso. So I meant there's a lot there in that particular question. I mean, I think there's a moral question behind all of that, and that's perhaps easier to answer. But then historically, I think you have to take each step, and I think that's what the historians are doing right now, is trying to dig below that. And we've had people who've done that. I think Robert Morley's book, which I would recommend, it's an early book that's looked at this subject, trying to make sense of the communication from various levels of the Vatican, and trying to understand, like, when could somebody have said something at a certain point. Part of the problem is, you have to go back to German history, is why there was a strong stance from 1930 to just after Hitler was appointed chancellor, where they said you cannot be a Catholic and also be a National Socialist. Now, each diocese was a little different in that. That's not been stressed enough, and not all of them were as clear in that statement. But generally, it was known Catholics could not be a National Socialist, a supporter of Hitler at the time. That changed very quickly in 1933 after Hitler was appointed chancellor, and more Nazis were appointed to positions. There needed to be more challenge early, I think, and that would have affected challenge later. But Pacelli, as Secretary of State, really asked the German bishops to they were on their own to make their own decisions in how to deal with the state. The Vatican offered a little bit more room there. Suzanne, what else do you have to say? I'd be interested to hear. You're immersed in the Vatican documents right now, I know.
First of all, forgive me, my Gigi, please microwave later. I share my kitchen with 3 children and my husband, and they're trying to eat their dinner. So no, Gigi, really. Let me, this is the big question. Whoever asked this question, I think it's the big question here. We have, on the one hand, we have the head of a city-state, a small country, even if you want to really think of it that way, but definitely head of a city-state, which is a political position with political considerations and defense considerations and economic considerations. But that same city-state also houses the throne of St. Peter and the Pope, God's representative on earth. And that Pope, the things he says, the things he does, the things he condones, the things he doesn't condone, affect millions, now billions of Catholics around the world for centuries sometimes. So these are 2 very different roles: the moral role of sitting in the chair of St. Peter, and the head of a city-state, a politician, essentially. I think that the kinds of arguments that our questioner raised about concern for co-religionists, what would happen to Catholics if the Pope spoke out, concern that more Jews would be killed if the Pope spoke out, concern that Catholic properties would be harmed. All of this was happening anyway. I think we should note, all of this was happening anyway, and the decision not to speak out wasn't stopping any of that. Could it have been worse? We don't know. But I do think that that was a decision that had a lot of weight, and now the Catholics really, ever since, have been trying to grapple with that. I think it's at the heart of Vatican II in some ways, and they're still wrestling with that. And I just want to point out on this question, which I really have a lot of passion about. It was possible at the time, in the middle of all of what was going on, to see a different way. And I'm just going to mention 2 pieces of evidence from the Pius XI archives and 1 piece of evidence I came across last month. In the Pius XI archives, that's 1922 to 39, both Edith Stein and an anonymous woman from Dusseldorf wrote the Pope to say what the Catholic Church is wrong for remaining silent and will suffer for this decision for generations. So it was really interesting, those kind of clairvoyant documents. And then there was a new document that I saw last month from unsigned, undated, but appeared to be by an insider, probably a German bishop is my guess, having heard Martin Niemöller accept guilt for the Protestant churches, say, look at this laundry list of everything we did to acquiesce and accommodate and compromise. Now, how are we going to explain ourselves? It was remarkable, and I wish I knew who wrote it, but so that's a long answer.
I want to thank all of our panelists for such a provocative and stimulating discussion tonight. And I really appreciate your time and your talent. And I apologize to our viewers because our time for the webinar has run out. And I know there are many more questions, and I do apologize. I want to thank my colleagues at the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So in fact, to close out the program, let's go to Dr. Rebecca Carter-Chan, the museum's acting director of programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust.
Thank you for joining us for tonight's program. With the Vatican archives for this period of 1939 to 1958 now open, so many questions await rigorous scholarly analysis, as we've just heard about in this program. And none of us expect quick answers. It will take many years and many scholars to carefully examine all of this material. And the museum is excited to lead some of these efforts. The museum's programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust has been an integral part of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum since its founding. We foster scholarship, teaching, and reflection on the profound ethical, theological, and historical questions raised by the Holocaust, some of which we've just been discussing tonight. We work with scholars, religious leaders, interreligious groups, and people of all faiths who are interested in this history of the Church's responses to the Holocaust and the ways in which religious institutions, leaders, and theologians have addressed this history since 1945. Through discussions like we had tonight with filmmakers, journalists, historians, we are able to highlight the latest research and learn more about Holocaust history and the role of the churches during this period. Thank you for tuning in tonight and have a great evening.